There is somewhat of an interesting anomaly with respect to the recording of mitzvot in the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. On the one hand, for most of the mitzvot, there is a short single statement, and in most cases lacking any detail. On the other hand, there are mitzvot, either mitzvot aseh or mitzvot lo ta'aseh, in which the wording is repeated a number of times. Classic example is the Isur of Basar B'chalav, where the wording of the prohibition is Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. Literally, do not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Shmot 23:19 concludes the set of laws listed in Parshat Mishpatim, laws that are bracketed by the narrative of the Aseret HaDibrot. The same command is repeated in Shmot 34 following Moshe's successful attempt at averting the annihilation of Bnei Israel on account of the Egel. In both instances, the prohibition is attached to the mitzvat aseh of bikurim that are to be brought to the Beit Hashem Elokecha. The third instance surfaces in Devarim 14:21, part of Moshe Rabbeinu's speeches to the nation prior to his death. In this case, the command of Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo is linked to the prohibition of the consumption of nevela. In a commentary to the first instance, that of Shmot 23:19, Rashi elaborates on the command of Lo tevashel gedi, where the prohibition of mixing meat and milk from a literal reading of the text would be limited to meat from a goat, limited also to the milk of its mother, and limited only to cooking, not baking, and furthermore would suggest the consumption of such food would technically be permissible. Rashi amplifies and expands the prohibition to include the meat of any animal, ending the lengthy commentary with a statement that Shekol makom shenema gedi stam, wherever in the Torah that mention is made of a gedi without an additional descriptive of egel v'keves b'mashma, it automatically includes meat from a calf and a lamb. Rashi then goes on to address the implied question of Bishlosha Mekomot Nechtav BaTorah. This command of Lo tevashel is recorded 3 times in the Torah, for which he answers, drawn from the Gemara, that we are not to adopt a strict and literal interpretation to the command of Lo tevashel, but rather one needs to expand the prohibition from the preparation, namely the cooking, the baking, the frying of meat and milk, to also include a prohibition against the consumption, even if the preparation was done by others. It also includes a prohibition of financial gain, such as the sale of basar b'chalav products, even though these products had been pre-packaged elsewhere, where the storekeeper, for example, is not personally consuming these prohibited items, but merely unselling them for others, for which he or she is paid. This is one example as to how one deals with the repetition of mitzvot. There is, however, another model, and by way of example, we will look at the mitzvah of re'iyah. This is the mitzvah of pilgrimage to a specified location 3 times throughout the year, a command that is recorded 3 times, firstly in Shmot 23, a second time in Shmot 34, and a third time in Devarim 16, where additional information is provided to the command of Shalosh Pa'amim Bashana Yira'eh Kol Zechurcha, that this take place b'makom asher yivchar, at some future location that God shall choose, a reference to Yerushalayim, and also a time frame, v'chag hamatzot, v'chag hashavuot, v'chag hasukot, with noting the nuanced changes in the descriptive that the text used for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shmot 23:17, El Pnei Ha'adon Hashem. Shmot 34:23, Et Pnei Ha'adon Hashem Elokei Yisrael. And in Devarim, the descriptive of Ha'adon is dropped in favor of Et Pnei Hashem Elokecha. In his commentary to Shmot 34:23, which is the second instance where mitzvat re'iyah is recorded, Rashi writes, Harbe mitzvot b'Torah. Many of the mitzvot in the Torah are recorded once, v'nechpelu, repeated, v'yesh mehem shalosh pa'amim. Some mitzvot, in fact, are recorded a third time, ve'arba, even a fourth time. In a footnote to the Art Scroll translation, the author notes that mitzvat tzitzit is mentioned 5 times, mitzvat tefillin 8 times. Rashi's explanation for the repetition is that this was done l'chayev, to make one culpable, v'la'anosh, and when necessary give punishment, al minyan lavim shebahem, for the total of the negative commandments amongst them. Similarly, with respect to a mitzvat aseh, a positive mitzvah where the command is repeated, one should have the opportunity of receiving a greater reward, v'al minyan aseh shebahem, in accordance with the number of mitzvot relating to a particular command. So what we have here is some tension as to how the Masorah deals with the repetition of mitzvot. One approach, as evidenced in the command of Lo Tevashel Gedi, is to interpret and apply explanation for the repetition. This is the preferred option. However, this is not always possible, in which case we rely on the fallback position of laharbot belavim, that the repetition is to provide emphasis to a particular mitzvah, either in the form of increased violation and or increased reward. The Rebbe will now apply this information to the commentary that Rashi makes, where he reinterprets the prohibition of lifnei iver lo titein michshol, expanding the iver from one who is blind to include one who is blind to certain circumstances, and the michshol represents the offering of advice that ultimately causes an individual injury or financial loss.